Okay, so now we're going to be talking about the poem Watching for Dolphins by David Constantine. Anything in yellow is something that we think should be commented on for its language significance, and anything in blue is a structural point. This is a narrative poem in which the speaker is describing a group of tourists on a ferry trying to see dolphins and longing to see dolphins, but at the end they don't actually see these dolphins.
And so at the end there's this sort of powerful sense, I suppose, of disappointment. But we'll come on to that a little bit more specifically. So perhaps the first thing to notice is that that first line of the summer months on every crossing to Perez. So this is a sort of a repeated action, this sort of hope being created within the passengers and then gradually fading away. This happens over and over again. And we'll notice that certain passengers soon rose from seats in the packed saloon and with serious looks and no acknowledgement of a common purpose passed forward through the small door. So the serious looks perhaps emphasising the power, the strength of their hopes. You know, these passengers are on a mission to see these dolphins. And then I think this is quite interesting as well, no acknowledgement of a common purpose. So even though they're all doing the same thing, they're not sort of receptive to one another. They're not open with one another. They're not talking to one another. They're all sort of doing this as individuals, or perhaps, you know, small groups. Even though they're kind of united in their purpose, they're not acknowledging one another. And I think perhaps, you know, we could go so far as to say that this hints at the sort of the alienation, if you like, created by modern society, and the fact that we are all operating as individuals rather than as a group or as a collective. Though we do see later that the poet imagines the ways in which seeing the dolphins might in fact bring people together. But certainly at this stage in the poem, people seem very much sort of separate from one another. And as we sort of move from the first stanza into the second stanza, we have this interesting example of enjambment. One saw them lose every other wish. Now, I think the effect of the enjambment in this particular instance between stanza 1 and stanza 2 is really to highlight just how keen the passengers are to see the dolphins, because that word "every" stands alone at the start of the second stanza and emphasizes the fact that all their other desires are sort of falling away, or being put to the side, because they're so focused now on seeing these dolphins. And I think, speaking more generally, because you'll notice that there's enjambment, in fact, between each and every one of these stanzas, and I think throughout the poem, that creates a sense of there being a kind of a lack of resolution, if you like. Okay, it's always sort of moving on to the next piece of the poem, the next sort of wave of hope, if you like. Nothing is ever sort of complete or fulfilled, and I think the enjambment and the fact that none of the stanzas are sort of self-contained helps create that impression of an ongoing longing, if you like.
Okay, and then moving on, we have even the lovers turned their desires on the sea. And I suppose you'd want to zoom in on lovers because...
I mean, I think here you'd probably expect perhaps that the lovers' desires would be focused on one another, right?
So it shows the longing of seeing the dolphins is overpowering.
Yeah, it's really, I think, sort of overwhelming, and it is even stronger, perhaps for this time at least, than the love between, you know, a couple. Say, you know, we could easily imagine, you know, a couple on holiday in Greece, and instead of sort of focusing on one another for this time, they're focused outwards on the sea, hoping to see the dolphins. And then, as well as the lovers, Constantine introduces to the sort of the cast of characters in the poem this fat man hung with equipment to photograph the occasion. And he describes that he stared like a saint through sad bifocals. Now, I think this simile, stared like a saint, is quite intriguing, and would certainly be worthy of comment. I think it kind of creates this impression of this being a sort of almost religious devotion, this sort of attempt to see the dolphins. The fact that he's staring like a saint, it implies a sort of a patience, a hope, and it gives the dolphins again, I think, a greater significance, as though seeing them would somehow be an almost religious experience. Though Constantine immediately undercuts that by with the detail of the man's glasses, his sad bifocals. So, if indeed he is a saint, and if this is a religious mission of some sort, it's sort of a strange one, and perhaps Constantine is already hinting at the inevitable disappointment of not seeing the dolphins.
Okay, and then carrying on, in the next sentence we have, or the next clause, others, hopeless themselves, looked to the children, for they would see dolphins if anyone could. Would, sorry. Mm-hmm. And I suppose the fact that children are often more hopeful and more imaginative, it might suggest that
they will see the dolphins if anyone can.
Yeah, perhaps they'll be the more eager searchers.
Yeah, and maybe it also implies that the dolphins, they're a gift of some sort, and maybe children, they're sort of often, especially young children, sort of considered to be very kind of innocent, if you like, and therefore more worthy, perhaps, of this experience of seeing them. But it's also interesting to see that actually some people have got no hope at all. They're hopeless themselves, and so they sort of pass on their hopes, if you like, to the children, because they think, well, if anyone's going to see them, it will be the children.
And then the end of the second stanza and the beginning of the third has again that example of enjambement from day after day, or on their last opportunity all gazed. And I suppose day after day, and then running on to the next line, highlights the monotony now of this hope, which hasn't yet been realised. And as we've already said, there are hints that it won't be realised.
Yeah, day after day, exactly. It creates a sort of monotonous, repetitive sense now. They all gazed as well. It's kind of, there's not really much focus perhaps anymore. They're just sort of looking out at what is presumably a sort of an empty sea. And undecided whether a flat calm were favourable, or a sea, the sun and the wind between them raised to a likeness of dolphins. Now, this is kind of interesting as well, I think, the sense that, they're debating, perhaps within themselves, because we know that there's no real acknowledgement of a common purpose, but within themselves they're debating, what kind of sea would be most likely to sort of fulfill or help them fulfill their desires of seeing dolphins. And this idea that the sea, that the sun and the wind have sort of raised, so presumably
sprayed up.
Yeah, exactly, sort of created a sort of slightly less calm surface to the sea, to a likeness of dolphins. So perhaps, again, this is hinting at the inevitable disappointment. The closest they're going to get to seeing dolphins is actually perhaps waves that are in the likeness or in the shape of dolphins.
And then it continues again, asking really what will be more likely to show a dolphin. So were gulls a sign that fell screeching from the sky, or over an unremarkable place sat in a silent school? So I guess you've got the question of is there anything that's going to signal the dolphins' arrival?
Yeah.
And we, I suppose, realistically know that they have absolutely no control over whether or not they'll see dolphins. So even the fact that they're debating this, and as Mr. Tadell said, presumably silently within themselves, kind of shows their desperation, I suppose, at this point.
Yeah, I think certainly the question emphasises their hope and their longing as well. Also interesting, the idea of a sign. I think we could arguably link this back to the kind of the religious language being used in this poem. A sign, like people talk about a sign from God, or this kind of thing. And in this instance, the question is asking, are seagulls a sign? And in practical terms, yes, perhaps. If the dolphins are chasing after fish under the sea, the gulls might also be kind of trying to get in on that action. So it's not a completely sort of unrealistic question, but I think it slightly sort of creates the impression perhaps that the passengers are clutching at straws here. They're just desperate to see the dolphins, even if the likelihood of doing so is fairly slim.
And then we have, from the end of stanza 3 to the beginning of 4, every face after its character implored the sea. While we have the enjambement, that's also a full stop at the end of that line and the beginning of stanza 4. So it's quite a short sentence. I suppose to stress that now they're so desperate that they're begging.
Implored is a really powerful verb, isn't it? It implies real sort of desperation. They're begging the sea. But again, no, it's every face. This isn't being communicated. They're not talking to one another. It's every face. So the expressions on their faces, sort of giving away their desperation.
Yeah, and they all of them, as it says here, wanted epiphany. So linking that to all of the religious words or phrases we've already highlighted and discussed, the idea of an epiphany is a realization, right? A clarity.
A revelation.
Yes. And that's all they're wanting. That's all they're begging for.
And then we've got, again, this word praying, again tying in with the kind of religious imagery throughout the poem. Praying the sky would clang and the abused Aegean reverberate with cymbal, gong and drum. Again, this very sort of, striking image, and it sounds, again, like a sort of religious celebration almost. The Aegean, obviously, the sea between Greece and Turkey, presumably through which this ferry is travelling. And it might be interesting as well to think about, what does it mean by the abused Aegean? Is it abused by the kind of the tourist industry, if you like? These sort of ferries going, back and forth across this sea, and it's such a kind of mundane image that actually the only thing that could sort of bring it to life or give it this extra significance or value or power, if you like, would be seeing the dolphins. And here the writer, instead of sort of explicitly talking about seeing the dolphins again, talks about the Aegean reverberating with cymbal, gong and drum, and this becomes a metaphor, I think, for seeing the dolphins. This sort of very loud, celebratory, auditory kind of imagery of cymbal, gong and drum. Again, we could link it perhaps to the idea of religious celebration. And they're praying that this is going to happen. So again, there's this sort of longing for it.
And then what begins with "we could not imagine" carries on almost until the end of the next stanza. So it's an extremely long sentence that's coming up, and it basically includes all of the hope and the excitement that the passengers would feel if they were to see the dolphins. So structurally, you could talk about this complex sentence having all of these clauses because it's adding so much of the excitement that they want to feel.
Yeah. And I think the word imagine is interesting here, because that's precisely what this long sentence is. It's an imagined version of events in which actually they did come. So let's unpack that a little bit and look at it a little bit more closely. So we could not imagine more prayer. So in other words, they're at the limit of their hopes and desperation to see these dolphins. And had they then on the waves, on the climax of our longing, so in other words, the sort of the peak of their longing, come smiling, snub-nosed, domed like satyrs. So all of this is obviously relating to the dolphins. And if they had come, we should have laughed and lifted the children up, stranger to stranger. So here we see the effect that seeing the dolphins would have had upon these passengers. And you'll note here the modal verb should rather than would. And I think that gives it a slightly different emphasis. It implies that this is something that ought to have happened. It should have happened. And I think it perhaps creates a slight sort of sense of resentment that this didn't happen. But let's keep going and think about what should have happened if the Dolphins had arrived.
Yeah, so we have the repetition of children, which we had in stanza 2, and they would have laughed and lifted the children up. So presumably the children, the young ones, the imaginative ones, the ones who've been really searching for these dolphins, they would have been lifted by the adults in kind of celebration.
Yeah, and also I think there's a kind of a sort of a metaphorical meaning to that. Lifted up. I mean, obviously, we've got the idea of lifting a child up, perhaps so they can get a better view, but also the sense of them being uplifted, emotionally perhaps. And note this as well, this is a really, I think, sort of poignant and powerful moment, because we know from the first answer there was no acknowledgement of a common purpose, but here...
This would unify them, wouldn't it?
It would unify them, yeah, stranger to stranger. There'd be this sort of union between them, because the Dolphins would have brought them together and they would have sort of pointed and talked to one another, and I think actually this is something that is quite a sort of recognisably real and true phenomenon. I mean, I don't know if any of you have experienced it, but perhaps when travelling or something else and some sort of strange or unusual event happens, and people who would otherwise be kind of locked into their solitary world sort of come together and comment on it and are sort of brought together by some sort of event. But in this case, obviously, it's worth repeating that this doesn't actually happen in this poem. This is all a sort of a hypothetical scenario, if you like. So lift the children up, stranger to stranger, pointing how with a leap they left their element. Okay, so the they there obviously referring to the
Dolphins.
to the Dolphins, and the alliteration of leap and left, conveying perhaps some of the energy. And we know that dolphins, the way that they sort of break the surface and then dip back down again into the water. 3 or 4 times centered on grace. And I think grace again, perhaps has some sort of religious connotations. Heavily and warm, re-entered, looping the keel. So now,
even with that verb looping, the present continuous form, suggesting that they would continue to do it. So it would be a lot of movement, which would be.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting about this as well is the way that that the poet sort of begins to imagine, or rather, he imagines the way that the passengers are imagining the dolphins. If we look at that next sentence, the final line of the penultimate stanza, we should have felt them go further and further into the deep parts. Now, this is, I think, quite interesting to pick up on, because the passengers have at this point lost sight of the dolphins, but what has replaced their visual connection with them, I suppose, is a kind of deeper emotional connection. We should have felt them go further and further into the deep parts. By seeing the dolphins, they've also established this kind of connection with them, and they can now sort of perhaps imagine them or feel them going further and further into the deep parts of the ocean. But then that sort of imagined hypothetical scenario comes to an end, and we get this rather sort of, I suppose, blunt, but soon we were among the great tankers, under their chains in black water. And the kind of the hope at this point has sort of...
It's disappeared, hasn't it?
Yeah, it's ebbed away, hasn't it? And it's kind of gone. The great tankers, referring to sort of these large ships, perhaps.
And possibly what's abusing the Aegean as well.
Yeah, I think that that makes sense as well. These sort of huge man-made structures, providing a very sharp and striking contrast, if you like, to the kind of the nimble dolphins.
And under the chains as well. The chains,
I think we should actually highlight
definitely, because connotations of confinement, and being trapped. So not only is their ferry boat smaller, obviously, than the tankers, so they're kind of
sort of feeling less significant,
Yeah.
perhaps. But also under their chains, so sort of imprisonment, or it has quite negative connotations. And then in black water, and I think this is interesting. The kind of the blackness of the water, they can no longer perhaps feel any connection, any of this sort of imagined connection that they had earlier to the dolphins. It's just this sort of abyss, and there's not much that they can sort of see there.
No, because earlier when the sea was talked about, we had the sun as well and the wind. We had all of these other things kind of bringing the water to life, in effect. Whereas now it just seems very
Empty
void.
and flat, and so on. We had not seen the dolphins, but woke blinking. So this idea of them of waking up, does it imply that this was all a dream? And certainly, the imagined version of events in which they did see the dolphins was indeed that. And so I think we could talk about this idea, or this word woke, sort of helping to emphasize the fact that this was in reality a sort of a very disappointing event for them, and that's then sort of emphasized further still by eyes cast down. That creates a sort of an impression of the passengers' melancholy and sadness, but with no admission of disappointment. So again,
linked to the lack of acknowledgement of a common purpose. The only thing that would have made them connect stranger to stranger would have been seeing the dolphins, but because that didn't happen, they've kind of begun and ended their journey completely strangers,
and sort of isolated and locked in their own world. And it's interesting to think, but perhaps a sort of shared expression of that disappointment would have helped alleviate some of the sadness, but in fact it does the opposite. It sort of drives them further into themselves. And so the company, which perhaps we might sort of see as being a slightly ironic word in the context, they're hardly a company, are they? They're just groups of individual tourists dispersed. And so again we get this idea of, instead of them coming together, dispersed again, I think is kind of an important word to look at.
They're separating and they're going off in all of their different directions, never to meet presumably again.
Unprepared to land in the city, which as a sort of urban environment provides quite a stark contrast to the sort of the natural world in which they hope to see the dolphins. So hopefully that was a helpful analysis of the poem. Remember, you can leave comments underneath the video. If you have anything else to add, or if you have any questions, we will try to get back to you on those. All right.
Bye.